universe these laws from the lowest, from the lowest point, which is hydrogen, all the way up to the more heavier elements, from the lowest elements to the heavier elements. So this being who brought the universe into existence must have had tremendous power to create the universe and for this universe to progress from disharmony to harmony. This being must have had volition, because the thing that brought the universe into existence must have brought it about at some point. And nothingness can't bring something about. So therefore something must have brought that thing about, and it must have brought it about at some point, and that exhibits volition. We exhibit volition as human beings. We came to this park through the law of causality. We decided at some point that we're going to get up, and I'm going to meet up with my friend. We're going to go to Speaker's Corner, despite it being my birthday. I'm going to go to Speaker's Corner, and and we're going to see what it's all about. So we have a being that has volition. This being has to have power. This being also has to have some level of knowledge, because it is instilled within this universe a mathematical precision that could only ever be appreciated by human beings who would be able, or creatures who would be able to think at the abstract level, where they would recognize that within the universe, through the means of language, they would be able to symbolically map how the universe behaves, to the point where it's extraordinary, to the point where you could use the law of causality, the things that we know today, and make very precise predictions based upon the knowledge that we currently have. Now that screams of what? Precision and knowledge. This universe must have is hearkening back to a being that brought the universe into existence, that has knowledge. Not only knowledge, this thing has to have wisdom. Now what's the definition of wisdom? The definition of wisdom, according to the Muslims, is putting everything in its rightful place, such that if you try and force something into a place that it doesn't belong, it's going to lead to a certain level of disharmony. So this being who knew that these fundamental forces must be fine-tuned in order for them to interact together and bring about the universe, for the universe to then progress from this point of disharmony to harmony, this being must have had a certain level of wisdom. So what we have here now is the fact that the universe was brought into existence by a being who is alive. Because we as human beings, we have attributes, and we recognize that attributes can only exist within human beings who are sentient, who exist. So if that's true for us as limited creatures, a fortiori, by extension, it's more befitting for the being that brought the universe into existence. So from that, or were they created by nothing, or did they create themselves? No, we didn't create ourselves, it was our mother and father. Again, it's pushing us back to recognize the law of causality, that things don't just come about by chance and probability. If nothing brought something into existence, you would see things just popping into existence left, right, and center, but we don't find that in life. We find that things progress in stages. Causes occur. They bring about effects. Multiple causes come together. They bring about multiple effects. So from that, we understand that something created the universe. Or were they created by nothing, or did they create themselves? We didn't bring ourselves into existence. Or were they the creators of the universe? No, we're part of the universe. So the parts make up the whole. So if it's true for the parts, it must be true for the whole. We're part of the universe was brought into existence. And so God is saying, those who deny God, they have no certain knowledge. They don't have any certain knowledge. So from here, we then recognize as Muslims that there has to be a being, and then we ask ourselves, well, what reason do we have? What is our purpose in life? What is our purpose in life? So that's one of the questions that we pose to a person who has a doubt in God. That if it can be impressed upon you that there is a being who brought us into existence, and if it can be impressed upon you that we as human beings can think at the abstract level, and we recognize that things have purposes, from the most mundane things to the most sophisticated things, all of these exhibit that there's a maker or a designer behind them, and that this maker and designer didn't design or make things for no purpose whatsoever. There's always a purpose.
I agree that everything is, I very much think everything comes for a reason, everything's in place for a reason, you meet people for reasons, being spiritual, meaning about a higher power or in the universe as a whole, would you say that there's a chance that all of these different kind of views and religions and stuff is a reflection of the same thing? Like,
Yes.
everyone's looking up to the same thing, they're just kind of calling it by a different name.
Yeah, very good question. Very good question. In fact, in the Quran, just to give some nuance to this, in the Quran, God says that mankind was once one nation, and then they began to differ.
Yeah.
They differed amongst themselves, and the Quran gives the reasons why, out of jealousy and hatred for each other, out of jealousy. But then God says that we sent prophets and messengers to bring mankind back to that original purpose. And that original purpose is an intrinsic understanding, like I mentioned, that God has implanted within every human being. And the Arabic word for that is fitrah. That primordial state that pushes every human being towards, it's like a beacon, that, you know, like the North Star. It's pushing you towards that recognition that there is a transcendent. But then it also says that belief is not enough. Even though you may have this pull towards a transcendent, there has to be a reason for why we were created, why we have this pull towards the transcendent, and what that purpose may be. So in the Quran, God says that the verse is very, very simple. It says, "O you who believe, worship your Lord who created you and those who came before you, so that you may become God conscious." So it's not enough for a person simply to say, "I believe," or "I'm spiritual." That spirituality has to connect up with the purpose in life. And the purpose can only be given not by us, because we're limited, but by the one who brought the universe into existence, who implanted within the universe all these laws and impressed upon us sentient beings who can think at the abstract level, and understanding that if this book has a purpose, if that camera has a purpose, if the dung that we see in the middle of a desert couldn't have come about except through an animal, couldn't have come about through chance and probability, that all the things around us have a purpose, and yet we, as a sophisticated creature, we don't have a purpose. So that purpose is God saying that, look, O you who believe, those of us who actually believe in God, the Muslims, God is saying, worship your Lord because He created you.
Actually, He addressed to everyone, mankind.
Mankind. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Oh, ya ayyuhan nas. Oh, mankind. Thank you.
اعبدوا ربكم الذي خلق. Yeah.
So worship your Lord who created you and those who came before you, so that you may become muttaqun, so that you may become God conscious.
When you said just there that it's not enough to just say that you're spiritual, it's not enough to. By that do you mean it's not enough to say that like it's not enough to fulfill your purpose? But like, what do you mean by?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that we recognize that there are certain values that human beings, when they come together instinctually, they have to implement if they're going to live a harmonious life. Like for instance, when you two came together, you instinctually know, and this is true for any person, anywhere, any time, any locale. Whether you've just come out of the caves, or whether you're living in the most advanced civilizations, every human being recognizes that when you come together, there's a notion of justice that we have to implement. And justice, again, in Islam is defined as putting everything in its rightful place. So when you come together, you know instinctually that if you deceive each other, if you lie, it's going to cause a certain level of disharmony. And you know that's not in your best interest. So human beings, instinctually, they also recognize that they have amongst each other a recognition that we have attributes. When we come together, those attributes push the individuals, whether they're in a relationship or whether they're in a small community or whether they're part of a city, they push them to implement laws that will sustain harmony rather than disharmony, that will sustain goodness rather than evil, bring about goodness rather than evil. So these are rights that we recognize amongst each other. And there are intrinsic rights and there are rights that are established by human beings. So for instance, you know, the laws in this country could, for instance, violate your right, but you still have that right. You have an intrinsic right. So, you know, injustice could be committed, but you still have that intrinsic right. So when we come together, we realize that, you know, we can't love for your brother what you love for yourself. All of these notions are there in order to help us better ourselves. Now, if that's true for us, what about the one who brought the universe into existence and gave us an indication of the fact that this being established these laws in their place? Doesn't this thing have a right? don't we owe it something? Does that make sense? So as Muslims, when we call people to Islam, what we're calling them to is that purpose in life. And that purpose in life can be summed up in the Quran in one verse. God says that we did not create jinn, which is an ultimate form of life. The jinn is the ultimate form of life that we can't see. Nor humankind except that they worship me. Not because God requires our worship, but we require that worship. Because it allows us to live the best version of ourselves. When we worship God, we bring with it an understanding of how we're supposed to behave towards God, and also how we're supposed to behave between ourselves. So when the Prophet he was riding with one of his companions, he said, "O Mu'adh, what is the right of God upon mankind, and what is the right of mankind upon God?" So Mu'adh, as any God-fearing individual should say when he doesn't know the answer, he said, "God and his messenger know best." So he said the right of God upon mankind is that they worship him and they do not associate any partners in his worship. Why? Because God, if he brought the universe into existence, he is unique in that. And so therefore, he is the only one that your spirituality, your being thankful to him, your worshipping of him, your recognition of him, your submittance to him, the fact that he brought you into existence, only God is the one that's worthy of that, nothing else. And then the right of mankind upon God, believe it or not, we have a right upon the one who brought us into existence. But this is out of his mercy. That the Prophet said, that God will not punish you if you do not associate partners in his worship. In other words, the right of God is such that it can be violated. If human beings start to take, for instance, other created things as objects of worship besides God, that's a violation of his right. And we're going to be held accountable for that. Why? Because morally speaking, we have to recognize that there are rights that belong to God and there are rights that belong to human beings. And we know that if I violate my friend's right or my neighbor's right, then there's going to be consequences. We're not going to feel very good. I know. We're not going to feel very good within ourselves, right? If I went around being abusive to my wife or being abusive to my mother and father, instinctually, it's not going to feel good for any human being who has any moral compass left. You know what I mean? So, if that's true of us, what about the one who brought us into existence? This being gave us a purpose, and there are consequences to this because we know that we live in a world of opposites. So in the Quran, God says that we created everything in pairs so that you may reflect. Right? And we know that the world is made up of pairs. We wouldn't know what good is if we didn't know what evil is. It's impossible. We would be living on a life like an automaton.
Would you say that's kind of the main argument, isn't it, about, because I know a lot of people, their argument against religion is that, well, if there's a God, then why is
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
war? Why is there death? All that. That's kind
Yeah,
of
that's
against that.
exactly. That's people,
About balance.
the balance, and not knowing what the moral duty is for a human being, where the boundaries are to be drawn. Because if you turn away from God, what's going to happen is what God says in the Quran. وَسَاءَ مَا يَحْكُمُونَ. That evil is what they estimate. They guess at what evil is. Why? Because ultimately, if my evil is my evil, and your evil is your evil, and your good is your good, then there's no way for either of us to be able to establish where the truth lies, because it's all subjective. But we know that human beings, we know that morality extends beyond us. Because, like I said, when we come together, instinctually there is that recognition that there are ways that we ought to be behaving in order for us to live the best version of ourselves and to live in harmony. So this points to a moral truth that is beyond ourselves, and it also points to, therefore, God being the one who is in the best position to tell us how we're supposed to behave. So the Quran actually says that a book that we have revealed to you, it is a mercy, it is a guide, and it is glad tidings, not for anyone, but for those who believe. And then God says, truly God has enjoined al-adl, which is justice, wal-ihsan, which is all things that lead to goodness. And God says, and that you may establish this among your kingship. And He has forbidden from you all things that are evil. oppressive. All of these things God has forbidden. So one of the companions of the Prophet, he said that the Prophet did not pass away except that he even told us something about the flight of the birds. So if you can imagine the Prophet telling us something about the birds, you can imagine him instructing the Muslims towards a way of life that leads to harmony. So this is the message of Islam. It's calling human beings back to the true worship of God, and it's essentially saying that the laws that God is giving you, it's in your best interest to follow, because in doing so, you join a fraternity of brotherhood and sisterhood, where racism, culturalism, and all these other isms are essentially negated, and the only thing that we judge each other by is our worship towards God.
I think we're going to have to go in a second.
No problem.
Something that personally steers me more towards saying like spiritual rather than towards religion is I find often there's a lot of kind of conflict with things, and a big thing for me is like I've got a lot of friends who like aren't straight, and I find the kind of, and I know it's kind of within each individual person to decide if they want to take writings in religious texts and take them as a certain way and make hate from them.
Yeah.
But I do find it conflicting, like everyone is like made in the image of how but then like homosexuality and stuff is like massively that is like conflicting, and I think sometimes it can really spark a lot of hate and that sort of thing, which is why I'm kind of wouldn't say I associate with a certain religion, because I do find that quite.
You see, organized religion, oftentimes people conflate between the problems that arise within organization and what God has actually commanded.
Right.
So in the Quran, God gives an answer to this. God says, Allah does not command to evil. Do you say of God that which you do not know? Do you say of God that which you do not know? And God says in the Quran that evil has appeared in the land and in the sea because of what the hands of men have earned. It has nothing to do with God. God isn't telling human beings to go to war over oil, to invade the country, to obliterate a civilization that have been there for thousands of years because they're not Jews. God hasn't told people to do this. It's human beings, by turning away from the laws of God and turning to the limited laws and notions created by human beings, that cause conflict. So God says, evil has appeared in the land and the sea because of what the hand of men have earned, so that they may taste a portion of this evil and then return back to God in repentance.
With that, because in some religious texts it does say outright against. Sorry, I don't have any quotes.
No, that's right. No worries. No, just.
But it's like outwardly says against like homosexuality, and so surely in those cases God is saying this is wrong, and because he's saying it's all kind of man is turning against man, and he's not
Yes,
trying
it
to
is.
go to war and all of that, which obviously but he is saying to turn against certain people and certain types of people, and that's what I'm saying. So how is that kind of like loving and all, like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So look, God is a God of justice. We recognize, like I mentioned before, we recognize when we come amongst ourselves, when we come together, that justice needs to be established. Otherwise, there's going to be disharmony. So God, who instilled this level of justice within us, is just himself. And justice, like I said, is putting everything in its rightful place. So God's justice necessitates that when human beings are good, he's merciful towards them. When they disobey his laws, there's going to be consequences. Now, so just to finish a point, right? Because it's going to take a bit of explanation. Yeah, because if we look at ourselves within the society, law by necessity discriminates between groups and within groups. And the law discriminates by holding certain aberrations of the law in terms of its severity. So for instance, if a person kills, the punishment for that is going to be far more severe than a person who, I don't know, slaps a person across the face. Right? And we know that to be an obvious truth. Now, if that's true for us, a fortiori, by extension, that must be true of God, because God is just. So his mercy and his love are not like some religions say, oh, God loves everyone. What, he loves Hitler? He loves Hitler equally as he does Mother Teresa? How does that make sense? So God's love is conditional. There's actually a verse in the Quran where it's known as the verse of the test, imtihan, the verse of the test, where God says to Prophet Muhammad to say to those who claim, oh, I love God. God says to Muhammad to say to the people, say, if you truly love God, follow me, meaning Muhammad. God in turn will love you and forgive you your sins, for God is oft forgiving, most merciful. What this shows is that the verse, the attribute of love, it's conditional. This verse points to the attributes of God, mercy and his love being conditional. God is going to be loving and merciful to those who obey him. But as for those who violate his right, that's for those who go around killing human beings, as for those who willfully do this, knowing that they're going to be held to account, why would God be equally merciful to the believers as he would be to the disbelievers?
So are you saying that if you are homosexual, you're going against God, kind of what God...
No, sorry, yeah. So what I'm saying is that when God tells human beings that there are consequences, there's degrees to this. A person who does evil, the Muslims aren't just told to just discriminate against that person just willy-nilly, right? I mean, someone comes along and says, you know, I've committed a huge crime. Well, God's merciful. And so if that person does it out of ignorance, there's going to be a certain level of clemency on the part of God. He'll take that into account. He's not going to just punish people on the mere pretext of them committing a crime through ignorance. If they do it willfully and they know that something is forbidden, that's different. So a person who, like for instance, a person who has a tendency towards their own sex, right? If they do this out of ignorance, then they may be, they're not going to be held to account because they're doing it out of ignorance. But if they're told now that what they're doing is wrong, morally speaking, and God hasn't told human beings to do this, then they're going to be held to account to a certain extent.
So you're saying it is a condition of God's love to not be homosexual?
Yeah, so there are things in Islam that God has clearly prohibited and things in Islam that God has made permissible.
But I think that's my problem, that's my issue though, because how can a God be all loving but then be against?
But that's my point. God isn't all loving. This notion of all loving has been put across by those people who claim to be following God in a way, but they misrepresented God. Because if God is all loving, then you have to either do two things. He's loving but not just, or he's just and not all loving.
That makes a lot more sense than...
Yeah, it has to, because otherwise the very notions of morality would break down. Because what? We're better than God? That we recognize that there's discrimination within the laws, such that whatever laws there may be, that you have a certain hierarchy in the way law, the judge deals with people who break the constitution of a land, break the law of a land, and we recognize that the more severe, the severer the aberration of the law, the severer the punishment. We recognize that for ourselves as being just, but that's not true of God. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when we look at it from that perspective, what we should be doing is, if we recognize God to be this supreme being who has knowledge of all things and knows us better than we know ourselves and has laid down this law, religion now should become not a religion like the choice of ice cream. Today I like strawberry and tomorrow I'm going to go and choose chocolate. It should be treated, as some of our scholars said, it should be treated like medicine. If you have cancer, for instance, you're not going to, unless you have a death wish, if you have family around you and you owe your family something and you've been told, oh, you have cancer, you've got to go through something known as chemotherapy and it's not very pleasant, you're not going to say, nah, no thank you. You're going to take that treatment because you owe your family a certain level of rights in being with them as long as you can. And you recognize the one who gave you life is the one who takes away ultimately. And it may be that through the test that he's putting you through, there'll be a certain level of expiation of your wrongs. And that'll place you in better stead with God in the hereafter. So, what was I saying? I've lost my train of thought now.
We are going to have to go and
No worries, no worries. So yeah, so this is what Islam is calling to. It's calling to a balanced way of life. It's speaking to people, telling them that rights are there that have been established by God, and it's in our best interest to do so. Religion is a religion where we ought to submit ourselves to God, not that God should submit himself to us.
makes sense.
Yeah?
Yeah. I
So
think
that's what Muslim means, by the way, the one who submits his will to the will of God. That's what Muslims are. So when a person becomes a Muslim, they merely declare with their lips, with belief in their heart, that La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, that there is none worthy of worship in truth except God, whose name in Arabic is Allah, whose name Allah was also acknowledged by the Christians and the Jews who came before the Muslims, and that the only one worthy of being followed in truth is the Prophet Muhammad, who we believe is the last and final messenger of God, and the culmination of all the prophets and messengers that were sent to mankind. So that's a rough message. So I hope the consistency of the narrative has been impressed upon you to a certain extent. But guys, just I would say, as anyone that comes along, the best thing we can do in terms of inviting a person is to say to them, if you want to understand the Muslims the best, open up the Quran and read the Quran. So here's a present for you, given it's your birthday. So that's the Quran. And you'll find that the Quran isn't like it's not like a story that has an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. The Quran you can open up in any place, and you can read, and you'll find that it flows, ebbs and flows. It's quite powerful. It won't read like the Bible, let's put it that way, or the Bhagavad Gita, or any other holy book.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Yeah, it's not, I think part of the else interesting.
And that's for your friend there. Maybe you guys can do a swap afterwards or something. All right, no worries, mate. Have a good day.
To learn apart from anything else, just to learn about those kind of
Well,
things. Become a more well-rounded.
that's why we love coming here. The least we can do is, spread our knowledge is the best way we know how, and also listen to other people. And in that way, the unknown is diminished, and it's replaced by knowledge, and so therefore the fear factor that the unknown brings, hopefully, should also be diminished. You know what I mean?
In all honesty, I can't see myself committing to any religion anytime soon. Just mainly off of the fact of saying before about how I very much believe that there's everyone within reason, anyone, serial killers and stuff.
What's your name?
Scarlet.
And yours? Jack, look, guys, this creator, the one that knows the universe better than we know ourselves, who knows us better than we know ourselves, we would say that call upon him. Because ultimately, God, in the Quran, God wants us to follow him. So you just call upon Allah. We don't believe in intermediaries, by the way. We don't need to go to a priest to confess our sins. There's a direct relationship between the greatest. You could be the greatest sinner, but you still have that direct relationship with God, that direct sort of open call, that bat phone, if you will, to God. The one who knows us better than, he says that he's closer to us than our own jugular vein. The all-hearing, the all-seeing, the all-knowledgeable, the all-wise. That's how he describes himself in the Quran with his attributes. So he says that, call upon me, astajib lakum, I will answer your call, God says. So be sincere, we would say be sincere, and we've heard so many times, guys, over the years, people say, I can't see myself become a Muslim, or following a religion. But God is the one who's the turner of hearts. He turns the hearts towards his truth. So be sincere, and who knows, maybe we might be calling you our brothers and sisters in the future. But anyway, otherwise you're our brothers and sisters in humanity.
Great.
Until that time.
Lovely to meet you.
As a sign of respect, as Muslims, we don't shake the hands of the opposite sex.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But I've shook Jake's hand, and Jake, you can shake her hand for me. There you go. Guys, have a good day, all right? Have a great one. Nice one. Take care. Bye bye.
So there's a bunch of verifications.
Allah you barak.
Oh, we're going to put them in the book and pray and put them in
So this is the issue. Yeah, just pass it to your brother.
Give this to the other brother.
You see, you know what's interesting? So find out this